Hello, and welcome back to HPHS Home Studio South, coming to you from Poipu Beach, Kauai, Hawaii. My wife and I live here in Kauai about 2 to 4 months a year, and for that reason, I created a mini studio right here in my master bedroom. And I did that so I could compose music, play music, record music, but also continue to make HPHS Home Studio videos for people who might be interested. This video is about an expansion that I want to do to my studio, very meaningful expansion, which will add a lot of capability to composing, recording, playing, and we're going to do that through Midi, musical instrument digital interface. Midi has been around for a long time, and I've used Midi to some extent, not a huge extent. I used to use it much more when we had a band back in the old days. But it is a technology that precedes all of our computers and digital audio workstations and the modern software that we use with those digital audio workstations. And it allows interface between musical instruments that are MIDI capable and other computers and musical instruments and synchronization devices so that you can have very accurate, very precise MIDI recording of those instruments and playback of those instruments through a MIDI playback capable device. What does all that mean? Well, it means that with pretty simple instruments, you can have a lot of flexibility to record MIDI through MIDI into your digital audio workstation and use virtual instruments to get exactly the sound that you want. There's a lot of software that allows you to do that. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples of that software as part of this video. So, what does expanding my studio to be able to use MIDI mean? Well, these days it's pretty simple because unlike the old days where you had to have quite a bit of gear to use MIDI, or at least some gear to use MIDI, now most of our computers will actually use MIDI through standard interfaces like your USB system and that kind of thing, so that you can have the benefits and capability of MIDI without some of the investment that you had to make in the past. So what primarily is the investment that I need to make here? Well, I needed to have a MIDI keyboard in this case. That's what I'm going to use as a keyboard. And with the keyboard interfaced to my digital audio workstation, along with some virtual instrument software like EasyDrummer, to be able to simulate drums, and UVI, which is a synthesizer which can do all kinds of terrific things to simulate different types of keyboards, from grand pianos to Moog synthesizers. I'll be able to really expand my capability to create different sounds, make music, and record it. So what's the basic process that I'm going to go through here? Well, first of all, I needed to get a MIDI-capable keyboard, as I mentioned. And I ordered one from my favorite supplier, Sweetwater's, out in the Midwest. And that was delivered here to Hawaii. And I already had my EasyDrummer software and the UVI software, which I used back at home at the HPHS Home Studio. So, going to go through the process a little bit to document how I set that up and what it looks like when you're using it and what kind of sounds you can produce, and that will be the content of this video. So let's get rolling. Having made the decision to add a MIDI keyboard, all I really needed to do was work with my guys out at Sweetwater to figure out which one. And Mike recommended the Roland A49 MIDI keyboard. 49 keys, quite a few controller key add-ons. Just a very straightforward, not very expensive MIDI keyboard. One of the constraints that I have here in my mini studio in Hawaii is I don't have a lot of space. So I really didn't have room for a full-size keyboard. As far as going with Roland, I have a lot of Roland gear in my main studio. I've got a very nice Roland 2500 keyboard. I used a Roland Stage keyboard for years. I have my Roland V drums. I really like Roland gear, and it just tends to really work well for me. So that wasn't a tough decision to make. Then I just needed to order it and get it shipped down here. I ordered a stand with it as well, a couple of cables. One of the cables that I ordered was just a separate Midi cable, because the Roland interfaces to my computer through USB, and it will do USB over Midi. I have found that sometimes to not be quite as reliable as an actual Midi interface, which the 849 does have. And so I can use that Midi interface coming out of the Roland with my Midi interfaces built into my Motu M4 as a secondary path for signal. So if I have timing problems or timing issues, I have a way around it. So ordered a couple of cables as well as a stand. I just needed to unbox it and put it together, and that literally did not take very long at all. It only took a few minutes, as you can see by this lightning fast time-lapse video. Not a lot to go through there, not a lot that's real instructive. It's pretty straightforward to connect physically the keyboard to my Mac laptop. Now, what I did struggle with just a little bit more is something that I'll show you here, which is the audio MIDI setup of the Roland or any other MIDI device with the Mac operating system. On your Mac, under your Utilities directory, which you'll find under Applications, you will find Audio MIDI Setup. Audio MIDI Setup is one weird little critter, and I cannot begin to tell you what it will look like when you open it. It will be potentially completely different from what I'm looking at. What I'm looking at is a combination of the Midi Studio, which are all these little blocks here, and as you can see, it's not its own application with its own application screen. It kind of just tiles a bunch of windows all over the interface. But you can make it behave a little bit better than that. This is a holdover from a long time ago from Apple. I don't think they've updated it in quite a while. It's not an application that's all that fun to use, and it doesn't make that much sense. And I actually called Apple for support and didn't get any. In fact, kind of got hung up on. So I'll show you here under Window. You can go all the way down to the bottom and look at the Midi Studio. And I like to view that in the full screen mode. So I'll enter full screen. And now I'm just looking at the Midi Studio in the full screen. Now, if you have a really complex MIDI setup, this whole screen could be full of MIDI devices and the blocks that represent MIDI devices. In this case, what I'm looking at here is a couple of blocks that are always there. Any MIDI device is connected via Bluetooth. There's something called IAC, which could have MIDI devices connected through it. It's a software layer. In my case, I have a device that's not actually hooked up to this computer, an M2 from Motu, and I have my M4, which is an audio device from Motu, and then I have my new keyboard right here. And this is where I had my difficulty. I wanted to make sure that I had a way, as I mentioned before, to use the actual MIDI output from the A49 keyboard. You can see that's represented here as an A series keyboard. You can see here there's two interfaces represented. One is got a MIDI in and a MIDI out, the keyboard itself, and then the one on the right over here is just the MIDI out. And I want to connect this MIDI out to the M4's MIDI in, which is what right here. And you're supposed to be able to do that just by clicking and dragging and dropping. If you click correctly here, it's got a little snaky little rope that'll come out, and you can drag that all over the place. And you're supposed to be able to connect it right to that MIDI input. And it's supposed to leave a line there to let you know that you've done that. Well, it doesn't work. And I couldn't get Apple to work with me to figure out why it doesn't work. I don't know. And so I have no way to know whether my keyboard is interfacing through the USB MIDI or through the actual MIDI. And that's one difficulty that I ran into. Now, fortunately, things are working just fine. So I don't have to know that. But if I'd had timing problems or something like that, I would have wanted to be able to isolate it. And I found that I could not do that. So that is one difficulty that I encountered. Now that I've got everything physically hooked up and configured through Audio Midi setup, the next thing I'm going to do is get into my digital audio workstation. Now I use Digital Performer, and anybody watching might use Digital Performer or any number of different digital audio workstations. Every digital audio workstation is going to have the ability to record MIDI from MIDI input devices and also to set up virtual instruments. So I'm going to go through the steps to do that in Digital Performer. You'll have to transpose that into whatever digital audio workstation you're using, but there will definitely be analogous capabilities in your digital audio workstation. Let's take a look at that. Here in my Digital Performer application screen, we can see that I have a project set up with a number of tracks, but really we're just interested in one of the tracks right now. And that is the track with the red ball, which means it's ready to record. This is a special kind of MIDI track called an instrument track in Digital Performer. And what it allows you to do is it will record MIDI from MIDI input, like my keyboard, but it also interfaces directly to another application that is going to be part of the instrument bank that I'm going to be playing, in this case, drums. So I've got this set to receive MIDI input from any source, and it is going out to my channels 1 and 2 and out 1 and 2, and it's connected to Easy Drummer Session 1. I could have several sessions of the Easy Drummer application by TuneTrack, by the way, which is a virtual set of drums. And I can play this virtual set of drums, so when I set up a virtual instrument like this, it directly pulls up that third-party application interface, and I can go ahead and play the drums with my mouse here, and each different instrument is going to make its own sound depending on what kit I've chosen and many other parameters that I can do. That's not very realistic for actually being able to play, but that's where the MIDI keyboard comes in. So with this track, I can record, and what it will record is not only the MIDI input signals, so they can be replayed, but also I can record the sounds themselves. But let's go ahead and we'll just make a quick sample recording here and take a look at how this works. Okay, so you'll see me playing the drums on the keyboard here, and all the first set of the range of keys is all the different drum sounds, as you can tell. Okay, so I'm actually going to record. I'll hit the record button up here, and see what we get. All right, let's play that back and see what happens. Now here again, this second track is the one that contains the MIDI that we just recorded. You can see the MIDI is kind of represented in this view as little dashes, and there's all kinds of different views. You can actually see sheet music for the MIDI that I recorded, etc. But when I hit play here, it's going to go across, and it'll hit that MIDI portion and start playing the exact same thing that I recorded. All this cool jazz to start with and some rock and roll. So this setup is very, very nice in your digital audio workstation, and with the MIDI keyboard, it makes it very easy to do the input of the different drum sounds. Now we'll add a second instrument track for a keyboard. So to do that, I'll obviously use the commands that my DAW has to add an instrument track. And I'll keep kind of going over to the right here. I'll add a UVI instrument track. and I'm going to add a stereo track. And that will bring in a window similar to the Easy Drummer window, but for UVI. I'm going to move that up here so we can see it a little better. And I'll add from the UVI sound banks, and I'll just use the Falcon kind of built-in sound bank here. We'll go down to keyboards. And we will add an electric grand. Okay, you can see that the window has changed, so now it's configured for the electric grand. Okay, so let's do a quick record on that. So, as with many things, how many of these virtual instruments you can add and how many of them you can synthesizing at the same time is going to be up to the configuration of your computer. But it's fairly easy to do, and you have a lot of flexibility once you get it set up. Now, even though this was a fairly straightforward setup, I did have some trials and tribulations. The first keyboard that Sweetwater shipped me did not work, and I actually had to ship it back. But they have great policies out there when something like that happens, which it does every once in a while. They ship me out a new one in advance overnight so that I would not be overly inconvenienced by that problem. I also had to really do some work on my laptop, which is a 2019 Mac laptop, and I am running the latest Ventura operating system. And I really had some difficulty that turned out to be the USB interfaces. I had to do I think it's called an SMC reset to get things working again. And before I did that, it looked like everything from my DAW to the keyboard to my MIDI interfaces were not working. And I think, in fact, they were working just fine, but the USB system in the Mac laptop was not working properly. So I will make note of that. And, you know, an SMC reset, you know, which kind of resets the USB ports, basically, was what solved that problem for me. I'm really happy with this addition to my mini studio in Hawaii, and I think it really greatly expands what I'm able to do here. And so I'll be off composing and recording and having all kinds of fun down here in the beautiful state of Hawaii. Thank you for joining us for this video, and please stay tuned for more from Happy Place Home Studio. We'll see you next time.